Hi, everyone. I was the chair for the Novice round in this room, which was between Carroll, UBC, Alaska, and Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt, unfortunately, had to leave to catch a flight, so they are not here, but I'll announce the results anyway. So, we did roll call, right? Do you only do roll call for this house? Oh, okay. So do we have Carroll DLEF, UBC EKEM, and Alaska BMLR? Okay, fantastic. So in no particular order for the finalists, we have from Opening Government, Carroll, David, and Eleanor. Our other finalist team being Alaska, Bryn, and Liz. And which leaves our second place in opening opposition, UBC, Evelyn and Emma. And our novice champions, who are unfortunately not here, Vanderbilt, Eric, and Will.
Okay, in the semifinal in AUC 203 with the teams UAA RH and D, UAA HCJM, Denver BWGP, and POU SAAW. We had a very nice discussion, kind of back and forth, and we did come to this decision. After a very great debate, we just had a unanimous choice in no particular order of opening opposition UAA HCJM. In closing opposition, PLU SAAW.
Alrighty, I chaired the other semifinal in AUC 133 with Carroll, Regis, and Regis. Going through, we had a lot of discussion, but ultimately we were able to reach consensus decision. So going through in no particular order as the team in closing opposition, Regis, MC, and A. And the team in closing government, Carroll, FSJM.
Judging the finals, we are hoping to have myself, Calvin Horn, Darren Hicks, Anusha, I did not write your last name down, I'm very sorry, and Sterling. If you are not able to stay for the final round, please see us ASAP.
A couple of things you're going to be getting out of this speech, honorable panel. First, some characterization of the status quo as we see it, some points on framing that we think are going to make a very clear and educational debate here. And then my main point of positive matter and the line that I'm going to be extending here is about advertisements and surveillance and the way that those two things intersect, right? So first on the model, we think that when we're talking about the internet, we're talking about a system of architecture, right? When the internet was developed, there were multiple different versions of it during the tech boom. We think that all of these different versions were being worked on independently, which coalesced then into the version of the internet that we have in the status quo. We think that what this means is that when we talk about architecture, we talk about like an infrastructure that has certain affordances, right? You have different rights and responsibilities when you go onto the internet. There are different things that you can and can't do. We recognize that one of the like primary things that you can do within this system of architecture is like advertise, right? We think that like corporatization was necessarily built into this infrastructure. When we're talking about regretting the internet, we're talking about regretting it as it was created, which is an entity that can be corporatized. We think that that's really problematic. The counterfactual that we want to propose is waiting essentially for an alternate version of the internet that does not have these types of affordances, right? That does not allow for this corporatization. We think that the trade-off that you're going to be seeing in this round is one of time frame on the point of opposition, right? Wherein we're able to develop the internet faster and like quicker and more efficiently, whereas on like government side, we're talking about the like flaws of the internet as it exists in terms of like corporatization and these affordances that were built into this structure, right? We think that a bad debate would be like government getting up here and listing off reasons why the internet isn't good and and uplifting a reason why like it is good. We don't think that this is a productive debate. Before I move into ads as like a necessary piece of the internet's architecture. Yeah,
how is it a fair debate to say we regret the internet as it's now and the counterfactual is an internet that is objectively better? That's just saying we want the world to be better than it is. Debate the motion, this house regrets the internet.
Yeah, so we regret the internet because it's allowed for corporatization. We regret the internet because the way that it's been developed has allowed for like people's privacy and people's like personal space to be violated and for people to be commodified and surveyed against their will without proper consent, right? I think that like I'm not setting up any type of an abusive motion here. Y'all can knock though, that's chill. All right, so first on ads, we tell you that this internet was set up as a system for revenue, right? We think that's incredibly important when we're framing this. We tell you that like what we did like that differed from the status quo back during the tech boom of like the 60s and 70s was that we set up a system wherein we didn't just have like papers and magazines, brick and mortar stores and billboards, but we now had a space where people could buy like virtual like real estate, right? People could create domains, people could create content, all of which was like geared around marketing, right? This is where we saw like internet marketing becoming like a piece of the job market and a piece of the tech sector. We think that like companies in the status quo like pay money to have their content sponsored, have it promoted, and we think that like it's largely unregulated, right? This is going to be a key point as I get into talking about surveillance. We think that to the end that this is a main affordance to the internet as it exists. We would rather have like waited until a version of the internet came into view that did not have these affordances for corporatization and for surveillance. We would rather wait until like that version of the internet came out. We think that's the counterfactual, right? Is that we don't get the internet as quickly, but like we do get like a better version that isn't like what we have in the status quo. I think that like that's totally fair ground here. So what we see in the status quo with the internet is that it's pervasive and it's invasive. We tell you that like you can't just opt like not to have a smartphone or not use the internet in the status quo, right? It's all around us. And we tell you that data extraction is also like all around us. We think that algorithms are constantly collecting data no matter what you're doing on like your smartphone or on your computer, or even when you're not engaging with those pieces of technology. We think that this is largely non-consensual. This is another really big piece of the internet, like where the like modern internet architecture fails, right? We think that it fails insofar as there's a distinct lack of transparency that creates situations wherein individuals can be manipulated and taken advantage of. What does that look like? We think that this looks like data collection that happens against people's consent, right? We think that it looks like Facebook being able to generate like targeted ads when you like did not know that they were actually collecting data, right? They can extract the like information that you input and that you like generate on other sites and other platforms and then utilize that to generate content within their like web sphere. We think that this is really problematic insofar as like the internet was like not developed for these consent structures to be transparent, despite the fact that you can't navigate day-to-day life without it, right? This creates an anxiety around the internet. It creates an anxiety around existing in these spaces when you have absolutely like no sense of what's actually like going on, right? Beyond like the dashboard that you see on Facebook. We think that advertisements then use this like invasive data collection procedure to develop profiles for people, right? We talk about like people having like their like digital profile, right? That is sort of just existing out in the sphere of the internet. And we think that like what this does is it like allows for this corporatization to feed in on itself. We talk about like commodifying individuals, right? And it's often some of the most vulnerable people. We tell you that like, for example, pregnant women are viewed as like a like capitalist gold mine, right? They're viewed as a gold mine for advertisements, and there have been longitudinal studies done where like corporations like Target and companies like Facebook find out that women are pregnant before they even know that they're pregnant because of the fact that they're constantly surveying and monitoring these ad spaces. They're looking at the like Google searches that you're doing, and then they start targeting these advertisements for you, right? We think that this trickles out into reality, right? It creates the anxiety that I talked about earlier, right? Ever since we heard about like data mining that happened like against the consent of the people like start to notice when like an ad pops up on Facebook about something you were talking about earlier in the day, something that you've never even looked up, right? This creates an anxiety in this space. It creates like a fear, which is not what the internet ought to be about, right? It ought to be about sharing information. It ought to be about understanding people, connecting with experiences and ideas. And we think that this insecurity and this anxiety is necessary necessarily like pervasive, and it's like necessarily counterintuitive to what we think the internet ought be. We think that to the end that this results in like tangible like impacts of people getting like ads sent to their houses, people getting like restricted in their mobility and their autonomy. We think that we ought not prefer the version of the internet as it is in the status quo. We think that it's contrary to what the internet ought to represent, and it's for the preceding reasons that the corporatization of the internet is working against the consent of the individuals to survey them and to restrict their like overall mobility. We think that you're going to be voting for government. Thank you.
How we ought to weigh this debate, because it is so broad, is by the broadest framework we can think of, which is that of the human experience and what strengthens our existence as individuals and also as a collective being of different humans. We think that what strengthens our existence is to broaden our experience. We think that looks like interaction with ideas and individuals. But the question is, how do we get that best interaction with our world? We don't think that necessarily in opposition we need to defend that all of those interactions are going to be positive, but instead that it should be evaluated on the richness and depth of that interaction. We think that what the benefit of the internet is it forces us to confront and challenge our beliefs and broaden the concept of ourselves as individuals as well as our global experience. Before I get into my 2 points of constructive matter, one note on the Prime Minister's speech. The hypothetical alternative that we get is that we should wait for a better version of the internet. First, it is important to examine what they mean by better. We think that they say that it is not corporatized and not invasive. Several issues with this. First, we think that you cannot fiat that this new, better version of the internet is not going to be corporatized or invasive, because that is the world we live in. We live in a capitalist world. We don't think that you can say that suddenly in 1990 the communist revolution was going to happen and that the internet prevented that. But we think, secondly, we think it's important to understand that abusive advertising practices have existed in a world without the internet as well. Perhaps it is not quite as invasive, but we think that you cannot fiat that this is going to be a world that is utopic. Lastly, we think you cannot fiat that there is going to be a version of the internet that ends up getting developed. More into that later, but we think it's important to understand what the status quo looked like before the internet and the sequestration of information. Lastly, we think it is important to understand that we concede that there are some invasive and abusive practices that the internet does propagate. But what this is a comparative about is whether or not the access and the good things that the internet creates is worth the loss of the internet in general, or that. We don't think that ads mean that it's not worth enabling that access for the broader society and human species. 2 points. First, talking about what is the reality of a world without the internet, and then secondly, talking about why the internet is the best tool that we have for equality and accessibility, getting more into those points about transparency. First, what is the reality of a world without the internet? And we're talking about the Dark Ages. Not necessarily like the medieval conception of the Dark Ages, but essentially we think it is the same idea, and that is that all information is locked in the ivory tower, and there are gatekeepers who say who can and cannot access that information. We think it looks like saying what kind of information can exist there in the first place. The benefit of the internet is that that information is no longer syndicated. It is no longer controlled by only the elite who are allowed to get in to create and to use that information in the first place. We think that we allow people to no longer have that information reserved only for the best and most privileged in a society, but for anyone that has access to the internet. Ignorance is not bliss, it is oppression, and there's no other tool but the internet to allow for that oppression to be mitigated at large. We think that simply things like university structures, in which you used to have to get into a university, you would have to appeal to your professors to be able to get information, whenever now you can go on YouTube and look at Khan Academy and allow yourself to broaden your experience and have that depth of information. That is the reality of the world that they must defend. But first, back half.
Okay, so I think that there are plenty of good things that we do to get information without the internet. We still think like news exists on our side of the house, libraries still exist, and books. Why is the internet the best and only metric to get this information you so want?
I'm going to get into this a little bit more in my second point here about talking about why the internet is the best tool that we have. Because we're not going to say that there are not other tools or that the printing press didn't exist before the internet. But we think the difference is that you now no longer have to have a printing press in order to spread news and information. Right. Several things here. We think that we need to talk about social movements, right? And the ability and accessibility that we provide for people to gain information about those social movements, for those social movements to define their own narrative, as well as for the ability just to organize themselves, right? Whenever we look at things like Arab Spring, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Women's March, none of these things would have been able to organize in the amount of time that they did, nor with the efficacy that they did, without using things like Facebook and Twitter to generate interest in them. The ability is that although you were targeted by ads, that means that Twitter says, ooh, you seem to like things like this. What about this new idea, this new concept of what a movement can look like? But secondly, we think it's just about accessibility. It means that people who might not otherwise be affected by this kind of movement can now Google and understand what it is that you stand for, instead of having it be told to you by somebody who does have access to this information that they are sequestering. Secondly, talking about relationships, we think that this is a multitude of different types of relationships. First, on just like romantic relationships, right? Like things from Tinder to Facebook to Match.com allow you to have a better understanding and better accessibility to people that you might not have ever met in the first place. We think it allows for families to keep in touch across continents and across nations. We think that allows you to be able to interact with other people that you might not otherwise. But we also think that we defend Facebook arguments, right? We defend you having to be exposed and having to understand why it is that you believe what you believe. Whenever you have white nationalists on Twitter that are confronted for their beliefs and are forced to understand why they believe what they believe, that's how you actually change individuals. That's how you get them out of toxic communities and force them to contend with the world at large. Thirdly, talking about innovation. We think everything from medical innovation to being able to Skype a doctor instead of having to go to a doctor's office physically. We think that all of these different things allow for you to understand and better access and better self-actualize because it is more efficient and you are not wasting your time. I grew up in the 1990s, and I mean, it wasn't a huge waste of time, but the amount of time I saved not having to call my movie theater to know what kind of movies are showing, we think those are the different kinds of things where even the smallest gains in time allow for us to better understand and better utilize our lives. We think that we also allow for there to be a fostered competition and cooperation among ideas that otherwise wouldn't happen if it's technology or simply your personal beliefs. Lastly, talking about entertainment. We think that whenever we talk about things like news and reporting, it's important to understand whenever we talk about this idea of data collection, that we probably wouldn't know that this data is being collected on us or has historically been collected on us if we didn't have access to things like the internet to tell us what the background of this is. We think it allows for people, whenever Turkey had their coup a couple years ago, to be able to say, this is what is happening in my country whenever no one else is speaking on it because the news agencies are owned by the government. We think it allows for things yes, fake news, but it allows for you to better compare and contrast those sources and understand what is real and what is not. We think that the uniqueness and the benefit of the internet is that although it does foster some bad things, it allows us to broaden and understand what our experience is and compare and contrast that with everyone else. Proud to oppose.
Okay, first I'm going to do what I think is some very necessary contextualization of the debate thus far, and then I'm going to get into some positive matters specifically about net neutrality. Okay, so on this contextualization, I disagree with Haley that the best version of this finals round that you all came here to watch is one where government defends what she calls the dark ages, right? I do not think that a good burden or a fair burden for the government is to say that we should be defending a lack of technology, right? I think that we, contrary to the POI we give a lot of room for pushback, right? I am not telling you that I get to stand up here and fiat to you that there is a perfect version of the internet that rises out of nowhere and is what dictates our lives forever and we live in a utopia, right? I am not assuming that fiat. I am saying that we should reject the internet in its initial configuration and we should wait for something better. Maybe that doesn't come. That's an argument they can make, right? This is a risky argument that they're making. They could tell us that this is too risky to let happen, right? They can tell you that we can't afford the time to wait because maybe we lose necessary progress during that time, right? There's a lot of arguments they could make underneath this model. I did think they were too dismissive of it. Okay, since you all seem to have maybe made up your mind otherwise that we just gave a bad model in the first place, okay, you know what, it happens. I'm just glad to be here, honestly. You can also evaluate the speech that Alex gave, the speech that I'm about to give, under the standard model for this round, right? We saw the standard model as something where we stand up here and tell you a bunch of problems that happen with the internet and say that those problems aren't so good and a reason to not like the internet on net, right? And they can stand up here and tell you reasons to like the internet on net. We don't think that's very creative, but we think that all of the things that Alex told you so far were just reasons why the internet is potentially regrettable in the most general sense, right? We tried to set up a different debate, one that is like a bit more complex and like historical. However, like, sure, we can have this one as well. Like, if that's what you want, like, sure. Okay, so why was Alex like fulfilling this burden or the one that we would have rather had? So we think that generally, ads have a lot of control over our lives. Like, remember that the internet is an architecture, regardless of if we can like go back and have a different one, right? The internet that we have is one that has architecture for privatization, right? In its very nature, it allows corporatization on a number of levels. Okay, and so we think that like these social movements that we've talked about in this debate, that Haley has talked about in the status quo, are dictated by like this corporate structure, right? Black Lives Matter, like the LGBT movement specifically, is like negotiated through Rainbow Cap, right? And we think a lot of this has to do with ads targeting LGBT people, right? That put like clothing as the forefront of how to identify yourself as gay, right? We think that this corporate structure is something that is regrettable, and we wish that we would have had social movements that could have existed outside of this structure, right? We think this corporatization in itself is a harm, is a reason to regret, because we think that overall people did not consent to this structure, right? Like, we basically all have to use the internet. Like, I don't think it's easy to abstain from using it. Potentially, like, people could, and some people don't have as much access to the internet, right? But on net, a lot of us really have to use it. Like, you have to go online to like pay your bills or like pay your rent, right? You have to go online to like have group chats with people, right? There's lots of different ways in which we like use the internet and are obligated to use the internet for work, for school, right? This is something that a lot of us are taught as children and forced to do through our adult lives. And we would rather that internet be one where you are not like you do not have to navigate corporations. You do not have to have Google literally mining your data anytime you write an essay on Google Docs, right? We think that this data mining is a fundamental part of the internet. We think that this is regrettable. We prefer a world where this wasn't true. Okay. On to my extension about net neutrality, right, and why it's not going to exist in this life, right, in this world where we have the internet that we have. We think this in itself, even if you don't think we could go back in time and potentially have a better world, we think that in itself this is a reason enough to regret. Okay. So net neutrality is essentially the ability for corporations to dictate like which internet sites you can access and how quickly you can do so, right? They like directly control your internet speed based off of what kind of website you are on, what company owns that website, etc. Okay, recently, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, there was a huge movement to have net neutrality on the internet, right? A neutral net where this process could not occur. And 8 out of 10 Americans wanted this to be the case, right? Before I go into like what happened, back half.
Okay, if you're regretting net neutrality, you're regretting the internet, but only the regulations that limit the internet, not the concept of the internet itself.
Okay, right. So that's why I'm telling you that having a non-neutral internet is the only possibility for our future. This internet will never be a neutral one, right? We regret that. Okay, why will this internet never be a neutral one? Well, when this came up to the FCC, right, when the FCC had to decide, 8 out of 10 Americans agreed this was the best thing for the internet, right, for it to be neutral, right? This is what the American people wanted, is an internet not controlled by corporations, right? If democracy has any say in this, we think democracy would have made the internet neutral, but it did not become neutral. And why was this? This was because corporations like Facebook, like Twitter, paid tons of money to the FCC to make this like not happen, right? They did lobbying, which made essentially kept these people from constructing and from being able to pass the policy, pass this policy. So we think like even outside of this very specific situation, corporations have so much lobbying power, right? The corporations that we basically like have to use in our day-to-day life have so much power over the decisions that we make, like what we do, how fast we can get to certain websites, and what we can do in those websites. What Alex and I are telling you is like a pretty basically like fundamental thing, right? It's that we would rather not let corporations have gotten to this point, right? We think that the internet has been the main technology that corporations have used to like explode and expand and become monopolistic, right? And we think that that is the reason why Amazon in Seattle is able to like push out like affordable housing, right? And is able to become as big as it has become, right? Amazon is an internet company, and we think that everyone who like lost their affordable housing because of Amazon is like something to be regretted. And so we think that like either way that you're viewing this motion, if you believe that like there maybe could be a better hope for us, like if we were able to go back in time, or even if you think that I'm just like listing negative things about the internet, we think that like we have done a sufficient job of doing that, right? We've showed you why social movements necessarily are corporate, right? Why ads necessarily with the existence of the internet run our lives and get to surveil us, right? And why corporations necessarily are monopolistic when the internet gets involved. We think this is a thing to regret.
This debate is honestly probably just too big for us to conceptualize. The benefits of the internet, how it changed humanity, is honestly too difficult for us in this weird 7-minute format to come to fore with. I'm going to do comparison with opening government, and then I'm going to give you the story about how technology has escalated humanity towards the death of the human condition, and how internet saved humanity from that death at its darkest hour. Firstly, in comparative, I buy Haley's framing about how they can't just say, we're going to get an internet, it's going to come slower, and then it's going to have all the benefits but none of the detriments. I agree with the Deputy Prime Minister that maybe we can make some arguments that the internet is far too beneficial to risk maybe not happening. I think it's really hard to talk about the societal factors that created the internet, though, and I think they're risking the internet not happening on their side of the house, and I think that's a risk that we cannot take. Opening government said, internet is sometimes non-consensual, life is non-consensual. They said, internet is a structure that you're forced to, like, you can't consent to. I was born into a structure I couldn't consent to. This is a reason to regret life. In general, I was born into a society where I have to pay bills. Whether or not I pay those bills through the internet doesn't matter. Secondly, opening government says internet creates anxiety. Like, I'm sorry for the similar response, but life creates anxiety. We are individuals that see other individuals, turning us into, like stereotyping us based on race or class or what have you. We are always perpetually anxious. Haley tells you about how at least the internet allowed you to access individuals who were similar to you. When you were in a small community and you were anxious because nobody was cared about you, you could go on the internet and find those communities that were interested in what you were interested in. Thirdly, on net neutrality, we won net neutrality. Like the FCC wanted to overturn net neutrality. We have a neutral net in the United States. Internet service providers cannot charge you more for going on certain websites. When the FCC tried to overturn it, it was probably internet activism against that actually made it so that didn't happen. We did live in the democratic society. How is humanity perpetuating itself towards death? Look, we used to live in small communities where we had shared narratives and we could understand each other, but technology began to change this. What did our communities look like beforehand? I want to talk specifically two things. One, we had a place where people knew each other and could rely on each other as support systems. And I'm talking pre-civilization here. I'm talking like syndicalism and tribalism, where individuals knew each other and understood each other, and things like disabilities were not a big problem because it was such a small community that everybody came together and stitched together. But secondly, everybody had a shared narrative. They had the same legends, the same stories that they told each other, the same stories about their uncle who was a hero, or what that little bush over there meant, or what the mountain meant, or who their gods were, or what the metaphysical and normative descriptions of the universe were. And that was incredibly important. How did we destroy that? A couple ways. One, in industrialization and a population increase, which forced people from these small communities by destroying their abilities to create wealth for themselves through humble agriculture and saying, no, you need to work in a city in order to survive. We think it's especially escalated in the past 500 years. We forced people out of rural communities and said, by destroying the environment and making it so there was far too many people to actually reap the benefits of the land and forcing them to move to cities to make money. What happens when we all started moving to cities and coalescing in civilizations? We lumped people into large groups where they had difficulty identifying with each other. When people came all to America, they were so different. They had such different stories, such different normative legends, and they had to work together in the same big schools and the same big factories, and they didn't know how to know each other. They didn't know what the story was. It was really hard to collectivize around a narrative when individuals were stripped from that tribalism that they were used to and put into this situation where different people from different places, where different normative outcomes came together and had to reckon with this. But look, especially in the past 300 years, we started moving towards megacities as the way humans live. We had a difficulty finding a new narrative. No, thank you. Why? Because now we needed a way to get information to massive amounts of people. The problem with having cities of 10 million people or above, and the fact that humanity is continuing towards cities to probably a world 300 years from now where we all live in cities, is you have to get information to a massive amount of people. What happens then? Like Haley told you, information gets syndicalized. It means that the only people that can disseminate information are the people that have the resources to do so. That is universities, that is newspapers, that is TV stations. That means if I want to reach everybody in the civilization, I have to go through somebody who's on top that has a ton of money that says whether or not my information gets to be shared with others. When you have such a large civilization and nobody understands each other, the only collective narratives that can be created are through syndicates that tell you what information is good or not. Books can't solve this like closing government told you, because books have to go through publishers that can make them in massive amounts in order to actually disseminate those to individuals. Newspapers can't solve, TV can't solve. What solves? The internet solves this problem. It is a message board where individuals can come together and share their collective stories without any syndicate. I can go post a video on YouTube that's 10 minutes right now, sharing my story, and hundreds and thousands and millions of people could watch it if they so chose to do so. Everybody can post on this message board. It is unmediated, and the mediations that exist are quickly being destroyed. Even people that don't have access to internet, it is super easy to build an internet infrastructure, far easier than it is to publish the thousands and millions of books that you might need in order to reach those individuals. Before moving on, closing.
Do you think that most people trust everything they read on the internet, and is everything on the internet always true?
Look, two things. One, it's a trade-off. And what I'm talking, and that's why our this opening opposition case isn't necessarily about whether or not information is true or false. It's about whether or not that we can share a narrative with each other. Narratives aren't necessarily true or false. We as individuals can now communicate with each other, and there's a massive amount of information, but it's an information that's us creating a collective story. And you might say, well, look, everybody gets you might say look, people get washed out in the massive amounts of information. But the fact that I can dab on stage and say like a boss, and you all understand what I'm doing, shows that we have a collective narrative that we can all put together. Memes, ladies and gentlemen, have saved us from that darkest hour. We were perpetuating towards a darkness where we could have no cultural narrative, and we created the meme. What is the meme? You post up a meme, and different people take their different interpretations of that meme. They take their subculture, and they place it within that meme to create their narrative. And I could go look at a subculture, and they're using that meme and an interpretation of that meme, and it helps me understand that culture as well. Memes, ladies and gentlemen, has created subcultures as well. The fact that I don't know any of you and you all understood that, and many of you might be on debating shitposting, means that we have a collective identity that's really, really cool that might have not existed in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, we needed this narrative. Because if we were going to get hodgepodge into megacities and small houses, and all of our information in our narrative was controlled by a few white rich people that had the ability to publish books and newspapers, that would be relatively disgusting. I say continue to make memes. Create memes that reflect your subculture. Create memes that reflect all of our culture. Very, very, very proud to oppose.
I will probably never understand the joys of being brought out of Alaska and saved by the internet because it exposes me to new ideas. I'm sure it's been very exciting to have the internet brought to Alaska, and I'm glad that John's happy. Somebody should make a meme. Okay, we think that John tells you that you somehow saved the world by using the internet. What Katie and I will proffer to you is now nobody can save us from the internet. John posits that this is a possibility of many positive probabilities. What we tell you is the internet rather expands the playground of permissible, pernicious politics. We'll tell you why this matters. First point of positive matter, the internet has allowed for the recent deterioration of democratic institutions. The ideal of democracy functions off the invaluable role of dialogue, discourse, and deliberation. The role of democracy functions off the invaluable role of these conversations. The role of the public sphere is to allow private individuals the capacity to convene for a discourse. There's a reason why it matters that this discourse is often prototypically interpersonal. The necessity of the interpersonal will be proven to you in this point. Look at Congress, caucuses, town halls, debates, coffee shops, pubs, salons. These things, the foundations of our democratic deliberations, rest on the truth-testing lab that only arises in the interpersonal. There's a few reasons for this. One, the interpersonal is the only check against the straw man in argumentation. We think that straw mans might happen in argumentation on both sides of the house, but they get far worse when you introduce the internet and the lab of truth testing goes away. This looks like Maxine Waters being able to say, in person, I'm reclaiming my time, or individuals like AOC being able to say, Chairman, recognize something very important here. whenever I do not have the interpersonality of communication in a deliberative democracy, individuals are now allowed to construe my arguments, misrepresent them, and pass them off as adequate responses, because the interpersonal is the only thing that checks back for the pernicious politics that the internet provides. Meeting individuals and having conversations within the realm of the interpersonal, within the public sphere, is the only thing that allows for the lab of truth testing to persevere. We think that a warrant for this looks like Trump's inherency right now. We are able to use the internet to retweet Trump or subtweet him with fact checks, but it doesn't matter. Rather, the individuals that have the best chance of reaching Trump are those who can avoid the straw man by diving into the realm of the interpersonal. Whenever somebody calls him an idiot on his inter-council, whenever they get to convene in the localism that you want to talk about and have those real engagements. Because what has happened is we've not expanded the realm of the interpersonal, we've exploded it past the point of integrity. The comparative of the world without the internet means that it's a world with good communicative practices. A world we can engage in what's essential for the preservation of deliberative democracy. This means that right now, democracies are literally collapsing because of the internet. Russia was able to use Twitter bots and things like retweets and ad campaigns to bring down arguably the world's greatest and largest democratic institution with troll minds who are hiding in Russian basements. This is a unique, pernicious tool that the only way you can solve for it is you require bad faith actors like China and Russia to somehow meet at a table and agree to never use the internet. How well did the Iranian nuclear deal go over? Probably not well. You probably can't solve for this on your side of the house. Before I continue, John, go ahead.
The problem is the interpersonal is intrinsically limited. It's limited by the fact of the people that you can see face to face. Sure, we might not hold Donald Trump as accountable as if we could see him face to face, but not a lot of people got to see Donald Trump face to face.
The problem with your side of the house is you paint a false counterfactual. What we tell you is the internet is simultaneously what led rise to your lack of localism. In a world without the internet, we access all of that localism. Second point, a positive matter. The internet creates a space conducive for simulacra, and it destroys lines to differentiate reality. Simulacra can be understood as a copy of an original that never truly existed. A great example to make this far more obvious is when Trump says, "Remember, I was always against the Iraq War." The problem is Trump never initially said in 2012, "I was against the Iraq War." The remember as a preposition positions us back to create a copy of an original that never existed and further pass that copy on as truth. The problem is that we pretend and it's presented to us as new material, as material that is specifically pernicious. The prevalence of falsities becomes more prominent because you deteriorate the line and the mechanisms to check back against truth or fantasy or realms of reality or imagination, worlds of narrative. What happens then is narratives become equivalent to something like fact or reality, and we're unable to check back. Think about retweets. Every time an individual retweets one of the 2,300 false statements that Trump has made on Twitter, they create a copy where they fortify truth by introducing nuance and eradicating the only opportunities for truth testing as a lab. This looks like never accessing predictability and never being able to actively determine. Whenever we talk to you about fact-checking on that side of the house, you cannot fact-check in a world when the President of the United States is still not held accountable for the 2,300 falsities. Fact-checking is not made easier in the world of the internet. It expands the playground of pernicious politics. Third point of positive matter is the example of China. Almost from the moment he took power in 2012, Xi Jinping made it very clear just how big a role the internet would play and the Internet of Things would play in his vision for China. After years of inertia during which cyber policy was fragmented among a wide array of government departments, Xi began to chair by himself a committee called the Central Leading Group on Internet Policy in China. This means that cyber policy sits at the intersection of Chinese national priorities and many other autocratic nations. First, the homogeneous internet for China is one that China enrules. This means one that guides public opinions, one that supports authoritarian government, and one that prevents access to information. This does not mean that China regrets the internet, but it views it as a tool to expand the playground of pernicious politics. It's a malicious open back door into global spheres when we see this type of activity growing rapidly. Beijing's priority here is to require Xi to act aggressively to shape cyberforce and cyberspace, both at home and abroad. This is similar to the internet being something like a weapon of mass destruction that allows nations unwarranted power to bring down entire democracies, deteriorate lines of truth for their citizens, and cut off all access to information. Whenever John tells you the internet has freed us, this is not true. It has bound us to a specific route of acquiring information that we can never truly trust. We think that the comparative looks something different, that on framework that will proffer to you something totally and uniquely different, if I can find it. Here it is. A regret motion is a motion that positions us to uniquely be behind the veil of viewing a world with or a world without. This means that you will always vote on impacts that are more long-term, because not regretting means you want it to continue. Vote on our causal events. Thank you.
Frank and I refuse to regret the internet because we refuse to accept that people are bad. We believe in the inherent goodness of people, their ability to create change, and the way the internet empowers people to do so. Before we move, though, into the new matter, I have a couple pieces of refutation. First, let's talk about this notion of bad societies, talk about how Russia used Twitter bots, etc. One, we tell you that authoritarian states have always used new technology to suppress people. We think this is an argument against progress itself and saying, look, every time we create something new, like authoritarians use it to oppress people. We tell you, though, that this actually creates a unique capacity for good because it's a transition of power to individuals to check back against that. We think that the old technologies that have been used by societies to oppress people have always been limited to the control of the elite, the control of power structures. The internet is unique in the way it changes those power structures and disparity. We tell you that's uniquely good and empowering to people. Second point, they tell you that this is the notion of the falsities and against this about how we hurt truth. First off, we buy opening opposition's analysis that the gatekeepers have always limited truth in the past, and there's a great expansion of accessibility to truth. But two, we think there's an important question here under the comparative as to which do you value, the threat of falsehoods or the value of truth? Frank and I are going to win to you and show you why we can win this comparative. Opening opposition did a great job of telling you about how memes save human society. Frank and I are going to tell you about how it saves every single soul and why individuals and the ability for individual people to change becomes so powerful under identity in the internet. We believe that the internet is enlightenment. We think that this is true in the notion of evaluating it before was the Dark Ages, but we think there's something unique about enlightenment and the creation and this expansion of enlightenment. We think that enlightenment has always been about an expansion of self. It's a re-understanding and conceptualization of self. We think that the previous internet or the previous enlightenment, was an idea of what it means to be human, of human rights, of contract theory, and what we too as humans are entitled to. We tell you that the internet expands this for a couple, and is symbolic of that in a couple of reasons. We believe, additionally, that the internet is not the end of progress. We think that there is a continuation and that it is a stepping stone. We believe to imagine a world without the internet, though, is to say, stop. We don't think that humans can handle any more. We think that that progress is inherently limited. Why is this the case? We think then this is where Frank and I can get into really unique comparative analysis that can win the round. Because we tell you that opening opposition, and as well as the government side, can have the arguments and try and frame for you, oh, internet good, internet bad. What Frank and I can tell you, though, is that while both are true, the way we see people interact with others, and most importantly, the way we see interaction with self fundamentally changes in an expansion of that identity. How's this the case? We think that the idea of the internet is to displace power. It's to say that power structures, that the way that we envisioned community was always not just based on locality and geography that John brings you, but has always been placed and putting power in the hands of the elite, of structures, of governments, etc. We believe the internet has always been about the empowerment of the individual. We tell you, though, that principally we will not regret this because we believe that principally we should always welcome progress. We especially think this is true in the case of the internet for a couple of reasons. Before I move on, I'll take opening.
Okay. John stood up here and gave you a simplistic, vaguely racist version of history. He said that ableism began with the internet. That's not true. Judge, when you're signing your ballot, you're deciding what rhetoric is winning rhetoric on this circuit. That's not winning rhetoric. Don't give them the one.
We find John's analysis of people's ability to change and build communities as something valuable. Okay, so let's move on then about what it means and this notion of regretting. We think that it's important, and when we imagine this world, why principally losing and moving away from progress is so harmful. The first point is we tell you that the way that lives have been changed via communication are essential under the internet. But why, though, does this become unique and especially important? And this is where Frank and I really get into this, is because we talk and we want to talk about our discussion of identity. We believe that identity is the number one impact, because life is more than just about living. It's more than just about survival, it's about flourishing, and we tell you that it cannot happen in isolation. The notion and the construction of identity can never and has never been able to be in that isolation. We think then that this is important for a couple of reasons. The first of which is we believe that in this ability to break the binds of those previous social constraints. We think that's something that's absolutely essential in the way that people are able to interact with others. But the second point, what we find even more important perhaps, is the notion of the support from others. We think the creation of communities has always been about the creation of not just like fandoms and communities, our creation of fandoms and communities, not in response to things, but it's about people near things. We think then the ability for people to create identities, to create communities around different objects, whether it be World of Warcraft or on Facebook, we tell you has always been about other people. We think then that's significant insofar as the way that people view their individual construction has been radically redefined by the internet in the way that we have disposed power to those individuals to do so. The next point that we find absolutely essential is this notion of the creative exploration of self. We think that the most important under internet is the ability for people to do so without limitations and without those consequences. It's the capacity to explore a multiple variety of ways without necessarily feeling like you are constrained or have determined that path. We think that the capacity for people then to create self in ways that don't have the same repercussions that it has in the past, but in a way that is far more diverse and far more immersive via the internet in a way that has transposed that power is absolutely essential. So what Frank and I bring to you in this notion and this question of the comparative, we think that Frank and I win because we recognize that there's both good and harm from the internet, that people can use it for both. But what Frank and I do uniquely tell you is the way that people are able to engage with progress is a belief and a hope that humanity can continue to do so. But most importantly, that each and every individual fundamentally gets to re-alter their relationship with power, their relationship with oppression, their relationship with identity, thanks to the internet. We tell you that platform is unique, and one that doesn't represent an ending point, but one that is a continuation of our human understanding of enlightenment and our human understanding of what it means to create self.
As someone who spends literally 4 hours on Twitter every day, I think it's pretty obvious that I as an individual should regret the internet, but I think that Nick proves to you why we as a society should regret the internet, thus winning this debate. I have 3 questions for you in order to prove this. First question, does the internet work in our interest? This is the debate we think the top half engages in. Second question, what does closing opposition bring us? Does the internet help individuals create self? We think the answer to both of these questions is no. And then, what does Nick bring you? Is the internet ruining democracy? Yes. All right, so first question that is the top half debate, right? Does internet work in our interest? We think that while Nick and I may sort of agree with opposition that the PM frames this debate a bit narrowly, and Nick and I think that we ought to completely regret the internet's existence and we would rather it doesn't exist. We do think that open in government brings you some really valuable look at the harms of the internet, especially related to corporatization and consent. We think that their framing and their argumentation can fit under a framework where we do completely regret the internet, so please consider their argumentation under that guise, right? However, we do think that when Nick shows how internet hurts all of us in our communication, harms our ability to do our democratic project and safeguard it, and is he is more expansive and fair to op, and we think that Nick still ends up winning in terms of government bench, but that OG brings you more than a lot of what opposition in this debate has told you they brought to you, right? So moving on to opening opposition, right? We think that Haley tells you a weighing mechanism for this debate. She says that we ought to see if the internet benefits our existence as individuals and as a collective. I think it's pretty obvious from Nick's speech that the answer to both these things is no. It harms our ability as individuals to relate to one another in interpersonal communication. It harms our ability as collectives to safeguard ourselves from pernicious forces who would use our internet to do harm to us. So we think we're winning on the weighing mechanism introduced by opening opposition in this debate, right? So I think then if the rest of Haley's speech is like she explains what is wrong with the internet, like what is good about the internet is that like social movements can organize better, we can confront people's beliefs, our relationships get better. What I think is the direct clash in this debate is when Nick shows you how first of all, gateways to information can be good and like to build trust, and how our relationships and ability to confront and discuss and deliberate others' beliefs is hurt by the internet, right? We think there is a direct clash in this debate. It's between these two teams, and Nick absolutely wins on this clash. And then moving on to John's speech, like it's interesting because Nick and I basically agree what John says, like up until like the 4:30 of his speech when he tells you like the internet saved us from that process. No, when Nick and I proffer to use the internet, continue that process, that we think it is a much more believable line of argumentation at the point that internet is new technology, which is what John says was ruining society in the first place, right? So why does Nick win this top half debate? He proves that the harms mean that all the benefits OP identifies coming from the internet are not worth what we sacrifice. Our ability to discern reality and interact with each other based on that, right? Yes, top half.
Yeah, so the internet might have some harms to democracy, but you have to admit it's benefited democracy a lot as well. Now, it's way easier to get information about candidates and also way easier to get information about all the ills that are happening in the course of a nation.
Okay, so this is kind of the question that I asked John about, like, is everything on the internet true? And this is why we do think it matters, right? Because, like, the reason that what the internet does is it puts people's narratives on the same platform and level as facts, which means we now think it's okay, first of all, to question people's narratives, which is a direct harm, and second of all, we question the very nature of reality, which means that even though all that information that could help democracy is out there, it's not doing it because we don't know if it's true, and now it's okay to question everything we see, right? So on to question number 2. Does the internet help individuals? This is how we engage with closing opposition, right? We think the answer to this question is no. We think they bring you an interesting point about, like, the internet is enlightenment. The internet is a way for people to expand themselves and their self-actualize. Like, but what we think happens is that Nick, unfortunately for them, already beat all of their analysis in his speech, right? They tell you the internet empowers individuals. Like, I tell you, like, not at the point when Nick proves how it harms, like, our ability to discuss and deliberate with each other, and especially when Nick tells you that, like, autocratic forces are trying to use this technology against individuals who want, and they are the ones that are going to be controlling it. This is another reason we think that OG comes back into this debate, because they tell you, like, corporations are the ones controlling it. So we don't think it helps individuals at the point when up and down government bench we've told you that individuals are not the people in control of the internet and the narratives on there, right? And then they give you this point about, like, creating identity around community is centered around community, and we create identity in relation to other people, right? But since, once again, like, Nick proves the, like, interpersonal harms and that the internet is harmed, interpersonal communication is harmed by the internet, we show, like, why without the internet these communities and our identity that we build through communities is probably better, because we are more able to engage with each other without the harms of, like, straw manning and raising narratives to the level of fact where we can question them, which are the direct harms Nick explains to come out of the internet, right? And we think that finally they say creating the self becomes more diverse with the internet, but what Nick and I tell you is that yes, but that diversity includes the diversity of not knowing what's true, which we think harms identity far more than the internet has the possibility to strengthen it, right? So moving on to question number 3, is the internet ruining democracy? Yes, and I think what Nick tells you is, like, far bigger than this. I wrote the question before he even spoke, so maybe I'm missing out on a little bit of what Nick brings you in that question, but here's what he brings you in his speech, right? He tells you that democracy is based on interpersonal communication, and our communities are also based on that, and how we find and test truth in our society is based on that interpersonal communication, and that is not the same function the internet serves, right? He tells you that, like, straw manning is decreased when you don't have the internet, because immediate checks when arguments are misrepresented are the only way to check back and ensure that truth and validity of argumentation is upheld, right? And Nick tells you that a world without an internet is a world with, like, good communicative practices for deliberative democracy, and that is why we think you ought regret the internet and wish it never exists. A key point of this is that, like, in the refutation to Nick, the only thing they say back is, like, authoritarians always use new technology to oppress, but the internet allows us to check back. We think you absolutely cannot believe this on government bench, because Nick shows you how no, we don't know what is true, so we can't check back, and the authoritative forces controlling the internet against us are far bigger than we will ever be able to be as individuals, right? Nick tells you about the simulacra and our inability to detect reality. He tells you that copies that aren't based on anything rise in the internet, and that fantasy becomes more prevalent, so narrative becomes fact, and then fact-checking is made more difficult when you have the internet, because we are questioning everything we see, and we do not know what the nature of reality is any longer, right? He gives you the China example to like crystallize this somewhat theoretical explanation into a real life example of when this happens and when an authoritative power has tried to use and succeeded to using the internet to control people, to coerce people, and to make their lives worse, right? We are bound to acquire information from a source we don't know if we can trust. That is the world with internet. That is why we regret that world. When Nick and I prove to you we can no longer do democracy, interact with each other, and test and determine truth, we prove to you why you must regret the internet and prefer a world without it. Vote for closing government. Thank you.
If you're going to hang your hat on democracy and the ideas of empowerment, egalitarianism, and collective identity, then you probably shouldn't regret the tool that empowers the most people, that allows for the greatest collective identity, and that is the most egalitarian tool to ever be developed. We tell you that the internet is what helps us understand ourselves, our communities, to form these communities, and is the most democratic thing to ever exist. Before I get into that, let's do a little bit of preview of what I'm going to talk about. 2 questions. First, what does the internet do for society? I think every team has had an answer to this. But second, what do we believe that people can handle this progress? We think this is how you sort out which team is right about that first question. So first, well, we get this idea from opening opposition that we think is true, that it connects people, it creates communities. But we also think we get a conception from both opening government and closing government that says, from closing government, that it corrupts the truth and that it leads to disinformation, and from opening government that it allows people to surveil us. We think both of those are true as well. So the question of the round must be not which of these is the most true, but whether or not we believe people have a propensity for one over the other. Whether we think they are more likely to cause positive change or whether they're more likely to create disinformation, which is why the question that is going to dedicate the rest of my speech is which one Josh believes people are going to do and why he makes the compelling case for why people are at their core good and will use this tool for good. So, do we believe people can handle progress? We tell you yes, and we tell you it's for one simple reason. Because when you get onto the internet, the reason for getting onto the internet, the vast majority of the time, is for community. But at its core, it's about understanding our place in the world. We think that the reason you look things up on the internet is because you're confused about something in the world and you want to better understand that. We think the vast majority of Google uses are not to try to misinform somebody, but instead to try to get information. And we think that people who are trying to pursue the truth have a vested interest in creating the truth, which is why there are disinformation campaigns out there, but the most visited website isn't a website where you can create misinformation, but it's a website where you can create information and create true information, which would be Wikipedia, a site that is user crowdsourced to create a collective truth that we can all understand and come to a better understanding about ourselves and the world. We think Wikipedia is where the internet proves that there is truth and that while people will misinform, people have an overwhelming propensity to correctly inform because they are at their core good and searching for good in the world. Okay, let's talk about the interesting material Josh does to get us there, though. Because Josh tells you that the work that opening opposition does to tell us that the internet connects us is really important because inside of that, we get to the interesting material about how we form our identities. And Josh tells you that we don't form our identities in a vacuum. I don't just wake up one morning and understand myself. Because the self isn't something that exists. There's no picture of the self. You can't, in your mind, say what my mind is. I have to instead see other people and interact with those other people to understand myself. And that when you connect large groups of people around media, around ideas, and around arguments, that allows you to better conceptualize yourself through conversing with them and understanding their experiences and how they relate to your experiences. And I think, and you're going to have to bear with me on this, that there is a fantastic example of this. One of the only communities that has no seminal piece of media would be the furry community. And before you sit there and go, wow, the furry community is like weird, think about what it means to not have a piece of seminal media. Well, it means that you have no one conception of what your life should be like or how you should identify. It means that through the community, you create your own understanding of that. And the furry community, through creating drawings, through having conversations, and through having collective parties and discourse, created an understanding of what it means to be something that society doesn't accept and society rejects. And that through doing this, they've created an understanding that would never be possible without the internet. And we would tell you that that community can't do that in the world without the internet, but more importantly, that this is going to be the people you care about the most, because these are the people who, without the internet and for almost all of human history, have been oppressed by society, or who have been told that their very identity is wrong and must conform to some idea of what they see in their everyday lives. We would tell you that you can laugh at this, but the truth of it speaks that people are searching for truth, and through the internet have found that truth and created an identity that makes their lives infinitely more positive. We would tell you that you get examples through Minecraft where media can evolve past the original creators. In Minecraft, you can build a computer that the creators of Minecraft cannot access because it's password protected. We tell you that media has the ability to evolve beyond any one person, and that is true democracy, is a group of people getting together and creating something that helps them understand themselves and makes their world better. I'll go ahead and take your closing, Gov.
These are some really good things about the internet. They're not weighing them against the harms up and down government fence. Do the weighing to win.
All right, so the ability to surveil yourself is a question about how we use information. I've told you that while there is lots of information collected on individuals, we think that your example of that information being used is advertising things that you want. We would tell you that's net good for you because you get access to things you want and things that make your life better. We tell you that when you talk about misinformation, we tell you misinformation exists, but writ large, we have access to more true information than we have ever had in the past. We tell you that when it comes to informing people about their own identities, your identity is better able to be constructed now than it ever has in the past. And so if you want the comparative is bad things happen, but good things are more likely to happen because we believe people at their core are fundamentally good. And this gets back to the original question in today's debate round, which is, why do we get on the internet? And the answer to that question is multifaceted. But if you actually think about it, it's because we want to be connected to somebody else. As a tool of connection, we get on the internet to connect to somebody else, to understand ourselves or them better. Now, we may use that to prank them, we may use that to create disinformation, but it is at its core a cool tool of connection. And we think that if you seek to connect with somebody, you are at its core trying to build community, trying to do good. And so when Josh tells you that this round is about creating your identity, about understanding yourself in that place, in that connection with society, that you will fundamentally use that for good because you fundamentally want to connect to people. You want to be a part of a community. And if you want to be a part of a community, then disinformation runs contrary to that value. And so there will always be more people trying to create true information, trying to create lives that are better than not better, because that's what benefits everybody, and that's what gets to the core of what the internet is. We believe internet is the embodiment of democracy. We believe that internet is the survival line for democracy, and we believe that internet is our way of creating a society that is better than any society we've seen before. We believe in progress. We believe in people. We believe in the internet.